One of Albert Camus' best short stories is also one of his most anthologized. It is The Guest. It was published in 1957, just 3 years before he died, in his collection of shorter works. And it's an interesting work from a number of perspectives, but primarily, I would say one of the most interesting is how Camus deals with the ongoing, at the time, Algerian War for Independence. It was a massive event in his life. Algeria had been under French control from 1830, after a fractious existence for much of that time. A rebellion started in around 1954, and Camus was at the height of his fame at that point, and he was having to grapple with his somewhat split identity as a French Algerian, as he often chose to be identified as a hyphenate. He had a foot in both camps and a home in neither, in his own way. And that was a fairly bloody and ugly war. And as wars tend to do, they forced people to take sides, and Camus really didn't. He was essentially both siding the entire conflict for most of his life during it. He died about 2 years before the conflict ended, but it was certainly a grisly part of his daily consciousness throughout those last years. Estimates of deaths of Algerians range between 400,000 and 1.5 million, and that's on top of roughly 32,000 French soldiers and their allies. And the Algerian War also became quite synonymous for quite some time with war crimes and atrocities, and he had to be very much aware of that. And he dealt with it, as he tended to, through art, through philosophy, through trying to grapple with what this means for him personally and also for the world. Now, he comes out with this story, The Guest, and we get this sense of the two-sidedness of his whole consciousness, because The Guest, as a title itself, is actually in the original French, l'hôte, and that means both guest and host. So there is a kind of duality at play in the title itself. And you think in terms of, well, the duality of the French Algerian Camus, he is exploring this idea of having sides to choose, and the impossibility of making a choice. And the story itself is fairly simple. It is essentially not unlike his like drama, because he basically takes three characters and puts them in a room and then studies what they do. It is not a particularly expansive canvas that he is painting. And these three characters are Daru, Balducci, and the Arab. Daru is an Algerian national who is, let's say, cooperating with, he is an agent of the French colonial government. He is a school teacher who has been assigned a somewhat bleak outpost in the middle of nowhere, basically, but decidedly removed from the native population that Daru had apparently requested to be placed among. He wants to be around people, and instead he is put dead alone, where presumably his students have to travel some distance and difficulty to get to him, and he is sort of stuck in between these two poles of the French colonial government and the native population. He is interacting in that great opening scene with a character named Balducci, who is a gendarme, essentially a police officer, who has a curious relationship himself. He is the voice of the colonial government. He is the only European within the canvas, let's say. But his position is complicated as well, because we are shown him initially leading the Arab while Balducci is on a horse coming uphill, and the Arab is walking, and Balducci is leading him tied by a rope. And you see a character on a horse, he is superior to whoever is on foot. So you get that dynamic immediately. And then the rope really just hammers home that superiority and that sense of violence and punishment. And it's a very striking image. But Balducci himself is complicated as a character because, well, his name is Balducci, and he is a representative of the French government. And then at a later point in the conversation, he is referred to as the Corsican. And Corsica is an island in the Mediterranean between France and Italy, and it has its own troubled history with its positioning between these two powers. And so Balducci, you get a sense, might be a little bit of the low man on the totem pole in the French authorities. But here he is the high man on the totem pole in this leg of that chain. So maybe he is taking out some of his frustrations on the Arab. Maybe he is exercising his power prerogatives in a vindictive way to make up for perhaps how he has been treated. Certainly the higher ups in his office were not the ones to say, I'll go out in rotten weather and deliver this prisoner to that schoolhouse in the middle of nowhere. They sent Balducci, the Italian-ish, French-ish Corsican. And there's a lot of grist for the mill there. And we are also told with Balducci that while he starts off calling Daru very repeatedly son in a kind of patronizing and condescending way, he also reveals at one point, I think of you, or I think of you like my son who died, and you're aware that, oh well, your son must have been a young man. He was probably dying in the war. And either way, there is something sweet and vulnerable about him. So there really are no bad guys in this very, very tough story. And then, of course, the Arab, who does not merit a name. And that is always a red flag. If you're not given a name, then that is somehow significant. And here, perhaps we are talking about how the attitude towards this person, either the attitude of Balducci, maybe the attitude from Daru, maybe even the attitude of Camus as the author, this person does not merit a name. Now, a name humanizes, we can say that, but it also particularizes. So maybe this one character is not supposed to be an individual. Maybe he's supposed to be representative of the entire Algerian native population. Maybe we don't know, but we can start to figure out those connections as we go along. The story itself is fairly simple. It's not a particularly interesting plot line in that neo-realist mode. It is a very simple story, and the literary power tends to come more from the symbolism. And the symbolism of the landscape is probably the most prominent, where, for one thing, as in all Camus, you get the omnipresence and the almost omnipotence of the sun shining down over everything. But within the landscape itself, you also get a sense of how hierarchical this society is. We are told, of course, about the location of the school and how Daru had wanted to originally be posted a little bit further down among the lowlands, so he would have contact with the Algerians. But instead, he was put up closer to the French authorities, perhaps who wanted to keep an eye on him. And Camus writes, he had requested a post in the little town at the base of the foothills, separating the upper plateaus from the desert. There, rocky walls, green and black to the north, pink and lavender to the south, marked the frontier of eternal summer. He had been named to a post farther north on the plateau itself. So here we get a sense of geography being a bit of a character in this, where the plateau is up high, and that's where the French colonial authorities live, and the natives tend to live down low, and the characterization of the green and the black and the pink and the lavender are all coloring, or literally coloring, or characterizing these two elements of the society in a very suggestive way, and the idea that always that Daru is stuck right between them. And he is a interesting character from a number of respects, but probably what is most significant for him is this sense of loneliness. Quite frankly, the solitude, the isolation. He is all alone. The story starts in basically a snowstorm. There is rotten weather. He doesn't expect any students to show up for quite some time. He is all alone in this little shack that is half classroom, half his little apartment, which you get the sense is really quite small. And not particularly luxurious, let's say, but he is always yearning for some sort of company, and the personality of that, I think, is really quite endearing, and is reflected in or contrasted to the harshness of the landscape. So Camus also writes, in the beginning, the solitude and the silence had been hard for him on these wastelands peopled only by stones. Occasionally, furrows suggested cultivation, but they had been dug to uncover a certain kind of stone good for building. The only plowing here was to harvest rocks. Elsewhere, a thin layer of soil accumulated in the hollows would be scraped out to enrich the paltry gardens. This is the way it was. Bare rock covered 3/4 of the regions. Towns sprang up, flourished, then disappeared. Men came by, loved one another or fought bitterly, then died. No one in this desert, neither he nor his guest, mattered. And yet, outside this desert, neither of them, Daru knew, could have really lived. So the confusion of the landscape and the characters, I think, is a prominent part to watch throughout this. The desert is being exploited for its resources, the good for building thing. You get the sense of the French are coming in and taking what they can from their colony and shipping it back to France for building. And you can see how this would engender some resentment. But this all contributes to a cycle of development and destruction. Towns sprang up, flourished, then disappeared. That endless cycle that is just unstoppable and indifferent to human activity. No one in this desert, neither he nor his guest, mattered. And yet outside the desert, neither of them, Daru knew, could have really lived. He is inseparable from his environment, from his home. But at the same time, it is not really accepting him. And you might think, well, why doesn't he just leave? Because there is something connecting him to this land, something that is bonding him to this society that he cannot just turn away from, and that's part of the pressure on him. Now, of course, he gets left alone with the prisoner, and they spend a somewhat touching, intimate night where it is remarkable how Daru seems oddly happy to have company. He brings him tea, he makes him food. The prisoner asks, "Why are you eating with me?" And Daru just says, "Well, I was hungry." Instead of just saying, "Well, no, I am too good to eat with you, so I'm going to stay apart and above," Daru eats with him, and they share a meal, and then they turn down the beds and they share a bed. And when in the middle of the night, when the prisoner, the Arab, gets up in the middle of the night and walks out, Daru is aware of this. He's awake, and he does not do anything. He almost seems like he is hoping that the prisoner will escape, so that he does not have to go through with his mission of delivering him to prison in the morning. But of course he comes back, and Daru still does nothing. He's just there, waiting for this crisis to pass without having to act, if possible. But of course, in the end, he makes it so that he tries to aim the prisoner in the right direction. He will not take the conscious step with the prisoner. He does not say, all right, you and I, we're going to go together. We're going to go in that direction. We're not going to prison. I'm with you. This is like the end of Casablanca. You and I to the end. Let's go meet up with some nomads and see if we can escape and go live an honest life. He does not do that. He just says, okay, look, it's you. You can go that way or you can go that way. I want nothing to do with it. He's completely passive in that moment. And he loads up Daru with some supplies, presumably enough that he can survive a longer walk down to the natives. And but it would be an awkward thing for him to be for the prisoner to be walking into jail with. How do you explain that he was sent out alone with a day's worth of supplies and a whole wad of cash? That is curious. But Daru refuses to act, and in the end, his refusal to make that proactive decision condemns him to a tragic ending. The sun was now rather high in the sky and was beginning to beat down on his head. The schoolmaster retraced his steps, at first somewhat uncertain, and then with decision. When he reached the little hill, he was bathed in sweat. He climbed it as fast as he could and stopped, out of breath, at the top. The rock fields to the south stood out sharply against the blue sky, but on the plain to the east a steamy heat was already rising. And in that slight haze, Daru, with heavy heart, made out the Arab walking slowly on the road to prison. Daru refused to make a choice. The prisoner did make a choice, made probably the harder choice. We don't know why. There are some hints about the Arab that Daru just shuts down, and we're not really told. His whole backstory of killing his cousin is curious because he acts against a family or tribe member, rejecting the kind of connection that Daru seems to so much want. But when he tries to explain to Daru, when Daru is sending him off, when he tries to explain to Daru something, he says, listen, and Daru just shuts him down, says, no, we don't have time. Daru won't listen to the prisoner, denies him that individuality, denies him that opportunity for communication, for communion of a kind, and refuses to act. And through that, his fate is sealed. He goes back to the schoolhouse, of course, and he finds scrawled on the blackboard or whatever it is, the same blackboard that has the walls or the principal rivers of France drawn on it. Essential school curriculum for all young children of Algeria, I am sure, it finds a threatening message. You betrayed our brother, community. Now we're going to get you, essentially threatening him. So he knows that he has been rejected by the Algerians. Once the prisoner gets to the jail, the French authorities are going to have all sorts of questions about why he was allowed to go alone and with all of these provisions. And so he is going to be in trouble with, at the very least, the French colonial authorities. So he is once again alone. He is all alone. There is a character to his solitude and his hoping for something else that he cannot really reach. That is very endemic to existentialism as a whole. That sense of being alone in the universe and looking up and feeling somewhat persecuted by it and bewildered by it and wanting to reach out but not being able to. Does Daru have any contact with anybody? Does Daru have any understanding of the meaning of his life? Is there any meaning to his life if he refuses to act? Would acting even make a difference? These are the questions at the core of existentialism. These are the questions that that this story is lifting up for consideration. The political reason for his loneliness is just a social manifestation of his inner loneliness. Daru has no community as an exile. He is estranged from the Algerians and the Europeans. This is the spiritual homelessness inherent in existentialism in particular, but also of 20th century modernism as a whole.